Hi, this is the Cat's Library. I'll be your librarian today. In this video, I taught myself how to animate a walk cycle from pretty much zero experience. So, engage speed paint. First up, I spent an hour and a half seeing what my baseline was without looking up a reference or a tutorial. I have seen a few walk cycle videos and read a book at one point, so this is to see what I needed to pay attention to in the following animations. This was 9 frames, and I had 2 sketch layers before I decided that I needed to do more research. I remembered that poses in a walk cycle are mirrored, in that the right and left leg go through pretty much the same motion, so I could copy a pose and make minor adjustments to which arm and leg were in front of the other. On the first sketch layer, I drew it in orange in the foreground and brown in the background. I used the previous frame as reference to get the proportions right. I was mostly focused on the legs and getting the head to bob. This is in contrast to the arms, which I didn't put as much effort into for this first pass. I have trouble drawing arms on a good day, but multiple poses are a bit much. I did work harder on the arms in the following animations. I had the playback on a bit slow, which makes sense in Photoshop when I don't have too many frames to work with. I moved on to the green sketch. Here, I was focusing more on getting the shapes to be more defined, because I wanted to see the motion better. I sort of thought that my baseline was looking pretty good. I'm not sure if I wanted to finish this, so I just needed another layer to see what exactly was looking off about this. This design that I went with is more tall and thin than the other animations that you're going to see later. I didn't really plan this, but he's also walking the opposite direction of the other two. Something I sort of like is that I put cross-hatching on the limbs that are farther away. I copy and pasted frames and then selected parts of them that I wanted moved and repositioned them before drawing over any gaps. This helped me to keep the design consistent between different drawings. It was challenging to deal with the leg in the back, which was something that I noted I'd have to pay attention to in the other animations. Arm pose, back leg, and the big one that I finally had to acknowledge after I cleaned up everything, the contact pose didn't make sense. It just looked like a dainty yet awkward hippity hop to transition from one foot to the other. Something else that I'm not sure whether or not I noticed at the time was that all of the poses were very closed off and the silhouettes didn't make defined shapes. Also, I accidentally made the legs longer than the combined torso and head, which doesn't look too bad, to be honest. When I wrote the script for this, I used a thing that put my words to seconds, and I was very meticulous about it, but then there's still gaps in the recording. I slowed down my voice and everything in some places, and then there's still gaps. Don't know how to fix that. But yeah, hopefully it went okay. While I was recording this footage, I kept replaying the animation to see what I was working with, and historically, this has been difficult for me to speed up. Therefore, I made all of the times that I replayed the footage significantly slower than the rest of the sped up recording. You may rejoice. This animation has 8 keyframes, though 15 frames total because this is the only one of the 3 animations that I added in-betweens to. As the after-study version, I looked up / reminded myself what those 4 to 8 main poses are in a walk cycle. They are contact, up, across, and down. Contact is a very open pose where the leg in front makes contact with the ground and the back leg starts coming off the ground slightly. I drew the contact first because that was what I was having the most trouble with in the previous attempt, and then I drew the across. The across is the pose where the weight is on one leg and the other leg is mid-swing. I copied these 2 poses and did the same thing I was doing before about keeping the silhouette the same and changing which arm and leg were front and back. I got this jaunty little walk out of that. Then I sketched in the up and down poses between the across and contact poses. I accidentally went into in-betweening mode and sort of forgot the concept of having the up and down poses actually being the up and down poses, in lieu of them being the middle of the 2 other main poses. I think I fixed it later? I just looked it up and I might have ruined it later? Animating is complicated. I was focusing most of my effort into getting the legs to look right, that I got confused about what was happening with the head. Another thing that I didn't notice until later was that I really exaggerated the torso going back and forth. Even in the final version of this, it looks like the animation is alternating between 3/4 and profile depending on the frame. I don't know how this happened. I had the frame rate set to hold 0.5 seconds for each frame, but at this point I set them all to 0.2 seconds because I felt it was about the point where there were enough frames that I could see the animation, even if it played back faster. I fixed a point where I forgot to erase to switch the front and back legs. Here I did an experiment for the second sketch layer that I ultimately scrapped. It was to use the automatic outline brush to draw the shapes that would make up the form of the parts that were going to stay the same size and shape, and I would rotate the pieces to fit the previous sketch. I think the problem was that I left holes for the joints instead of overlapping the shapes, and so I messed up the proportions. This probably could have worked with some impressive layering, but these animation documents get big and crazy enough as is, and I guess I didn't want to strain my system. I went into the final line art with my usual tapered illustration brush. I don't think that this is what I was supposed to do because the lines ended up slightly different, but it didn't look as bad as it seems. I drew the first 4 frames in order using the previous frame as a reference, before copying them for the last 8 frames. I really need to work on my arm anatomy, like for drawing. Might also need to work out more. I also think I was having trouble getting my mind around swinging arms, since I don't really walk with my arms like this, and I didn't really study that part of my references very thoroughly. I drew in a bit of color for the background, because I still have that color addiction. I drew this line for the horizon, and at some point, for some unknown reason, I put it on lower opacity for a frame or so. I thought the effect made it look like the character was moving since the ground was slightly different, and so kept it in the final. Then I went forth and began drawing the in-between frames. I didn't want to figure out where exactly the in-betweens went when it came to copying and changing the features, and so I drew each of them in manually. This gave an accidental effect, where since I wasn't paying attention to which frames were correlated, then they were in slightly different placements to each other, and some of the shapes were slightly different from each other. This made the animation look more organic. Less professional, but more organic. I set most of the in-betweens to 0.1 seconds, though a few I made 0.2 to look better or something. I quite obviously don't know what I'm doing. I roughly blocked in a gray color so that the little guy could stand out from the background. I wasn't entirely focused on keeping the gray within the lines. With the colors, I went back to copy and pasting the correlating frames. It was very obvious where the in-betweens I didn't flip were, but I did my best to keep the colors in the lines. This section took the longest. It got very complicated at parts, and I think what I'm going to do is show a few frames of each new layer of animation, each sketch layer and each line art, and then show each time that I rewatched the animation and cut out the rest. I started out with a red sketch. I drew out the 4 main poses, sort of how I did it before, on top of each other. There were 2 things that I wanted to do differently here. The first was to make the walk expressive, specifically to make a mad walk, which I failed at because this is literally the 3rd walk cycle I've ever done. The second new thing was to make it look like the character was walking across the screen, and so I copied all of the frames and moved them into evenly spaced locations across the canvas. I had him walk off screen and then come back around, in a loop. I changed the across sketch because I did it wrong the first time. I had the head at the highest at what was supposed to be the down pose, and lowest at what was supposed to be the up pose. The across pose didn't have the legs overlapping with each other at first, but I did fix this on this layer. Then I moved on to the second sketch, which was a thick black sketch. The next 2 passes after this one are also black sketches. I guess because I didn't want to distract myself by making everything pretty. This layer was about refining the shapes, keeping the drawings more in proportion with each other than the first pass of animation, and determining which limbs were in front and in back. I would draw a frame and then copy and place it in the correct space. This is in contrast to what I was doing on the last pass, drawing all of the frames and then putting them into place, and what I did on the previous 2 animations, having the poses overlap each other. Specifically, pretty early in the process, I drew 2 versions of the same pose that I alternated between throughout this walk cycle. Then I drew the next frame and repeated it for every pose. With the arms, I experimented with a little bit of foreshortening, where when the arm was overlapping with the body, it was closer to the camera. I think I did this by copying the arm and then distorting it so it looks a bit weird, which is a sketch is fine, but I also didn't stick with the whole foreshortening thing coming into the other sketches. I also had a frame that I intentionally left blank and wrote empty on it between where the character guy walks off screen and where he comes back around. There were a lot of different layers that I was working with in both the number of sketch passes and the frame number for this animation, and so I spent a lot of time organizing my files. I'm not sure how much of this process I cut out, since the actual drawing part is much more exciting to watch. On the down pose, I bent the front leg a bit more to an almost 90-degree angle. This was in the hopes that it would help the walk look angrier, like he was really bringing his leg up to stomp it back down, but it actually gave a more jaunty effect. With this pose and some of the others, I drew both legs sort of overlapping with each other and erased what I needed. So this next sketch layer is what I thought would be the final layer, and I went sorta crazy with this one. I decided to animate each section separately and started with the head and torso. This character is a cat, that's why his head looks like that. I also had one drawing for the head and torso and copied it a bunch of times in every position in the cycle, getting that bobbing up and down motion right. Next, I moved on to the legs. That is the part of a walk cycle that you'd think would be the most complicated, but I actually had more trouble with the arms. More on that later. I think what happened here was that I did such a good job on the previous two sketch layers that this went pretty smoothly. Having a consistent torso to work off of helped with getting the legs the right size and keeping the hips / the line at the top of the pants consistent. I also worked on making the feet / shoes match the pose, especially with the poses where the feet were being lifted into the air and landing on the ground. When it comes to the arms, my first problem was that I drew the hands sort of weird. The other thing is that I copied and flipped the front arm. I also tried to do that with the torso and position the arms according to where they were on the previous black sketch. I also had both arms fully in each frame and erased the bits that didn't make sense. The back hand on this layer doesn't make any sense. Logically, there should be more palm showing in comparison to the hand in front. Also, both thumbs don't make sense. Watching the footage, I don't think the shoulders stayed in the right place. Like, they don't quite line up with the torso animation? I'm not sure. Next, I decided to add in the tail. I started out by planning out the arc that the tail would go through. On the background layer, I put a dot in the middle of the hips for each of the 4 keyframes and copied it. Then I drew a line connecting all of the dots, and drew 4 tails on that line. I wasn't sure if the arc was smooth or bouncy enough, but my sister really liked the tail, so I guess I did a good job. I got a bit lazy when it came to the face, both on this layer and when it comes to the final line art layer. I never got around to coloring this animation. I drew one face, which I copied and pasted. The most exciting part of this section was the ears. I rotated the ears so that they would be more upturned at the height of the stride and down at the lowest point of the stride. No idea if that should be reversed, where the top of the stride is down and the bottom is up. I did not really use a reference to the secondary animation, just for the key poses. When it came to drawing the shirt, I think that this is where I finally decided that that back arm was off, and I needed to do a final sketch pass of the animation. Therefore, I drew in the shirt pretty sketchily. I placed all of the shirts, but I don't think that I modified them to match which arm was in front and back on this layer. Now we get to my last pass of animation. Since the files were getting so crazy, I drew each frame on one layer instead of segmenting all of the pieces. I added some fuzz on his face and a second ear and whiskers. I always forget that cats have whiskers. He has a defined shirt collar now. I changed the hands to paws because I found that easier to wrap my mind around. For this pass, I went back to drawing the frames consecutively, and I used the previous frame as a reference. I brought some color back by temporarily turning that previous frame green, so I could tell it apart from what I was currently drawing. A little thing that I did here was add a blink animation, but since I animated it on 4 frames and then repeated it a bunch, I might have overdone it. I added some secondary motion to the hair and whiskers. Throughout the process, I was trying to simplify the shirt because as the last thing I added to the previous animation pass, it was the roughest. Try to imagine how the fabric would change from pose to pose. I didn't look up for shirt reference. I added a paw pad to the paw in the back. This was one of those things I had to keep track of while I was using the same general pose, but switching which limbs were in front and back. The frame that I started out with had part of the shoe and tail off screen, and so I had to add them into subsequent frames. I had to focus on the points where the arms overlapped with the tail because the back arm had to be behind the tail and the front arm had to be in front. After all 8 frames were done, I copied the remaining frames and placed them so as to fill out the animation. And that's it for today. The next video should be the yak video, which I started drawing a while back and then have done pretty much nothing with, so don't know when that's out. But then there's going to be a mermaid, which I promised myself I'd do, but I've been having a little bit of writer's block. So we're going to see, well, not artist block. We'll see if I actually get around to doing it. Okay, see you when I see you. Bye!